Männer, es war ein langer Krieg. Ihr habt tapfer und stolz für euer Vaterland gekämpft. Seid eine besondere Truppe, die ineinander einen...
Hey everyone, this is the Hydra Hut, and let's talk about Chapter 4 of Klaus. This is by Grant Morrison and Dan Mora. I'm assuming you've been following along if you're already on this chapter with me. But I kind of misspoke at the end of the last video. I said this is where it was going to start getting kind of dark. It's actually, Chapter 4 is more story and character background. So let's just dive in. So, Chapter 4 starts out with this frozen woman out in a plain of ice. It's actually, if you notice, it's basically the same pose that the Baron's wife took when he yelled at her and then left her on the balcony. Anyway, you also notice there's something in her arm. Aside from that, you'll notice the fantastic art. Up here, we get a little bit of narration. Once upon a time. That's really the only narration for this page. Then we see two people, a redhead and this guy who may or may not look kind of familiar, if you've been paying attention. And they find this statue, and they obviously they know the woman is dead, but the redheaded guy can hear the baby making noise, and he pulls her out of the woman's arms, and the baby's alive. So they quickly rush him back to town. This is, if you recognize, this is Grimsvig. Actually the same path that Santa took when he first entered town. And now he's riding on a sleigh pulled by reindeer. Anyway. So they go into the town. They bring the king, or the child, to the king of the town. I guess he's the baron of this town. Some women immediately take the child away. They're telling a story about the frozen woman and how they could hear music playing in the background. Or not in the background, but playing in the distance when they found the kid. And then we get this lovely shot of the Baron, the current Baron at this time, and his wife looking at the northern lights, the lit Christmas tree, basically talking about how there has to be a reason why the boy survived. We jump back to some narration. As the years passed, the story grew that the child was saved out on the ice by the warmth of his heart, and they called him Klaus, which means victory of the people. We see him playing with some young boys, his age, having a good time. Here, we see him carving up something. One of his friends watching him, pretty shocked that this kid knows how to do that. Some of the kids in the background playing with their toys. Obviously, this is when Grimsvig was a much happier place. And then, we see the man who saved Klaus earlier in the story. And this little red-headed girl that we can assume is his daughter going by the hair. Klaus is interested, to say the least. As we move on, we see the little girl burying a pet bird, basically, in the stone path. Klaus is feeling for her, and that's actually what he was carving, was a little toy bird. And he sends it her way. It flies over. You might recognize this from earlier on in the story. This is the same one that we saw Dagmar hold. If you haven't figured it out, that may or may not be Dagmar. So, basically that forges a friendship between Klaus and this little red-headed girl. And then we see a lot of story about how they were good friends growing up together. Again, we have that dark-haired guy and her father watching happily. And then we see this boy who looks almost exactly like Jonas. And we can assume that this is the Baron when he was a child. And he says, "I'd do anything to make her love me." And then we get this voice. Anything. And then we switch back to the scene where we last left Klaus and Dagmar. Klaus, of course, sitting in the windowsill looking dashing. And she's basically threatening to pull this cord and call the guards if he doesn't leave. And ask what he wants. And he's basically starts accusing her of being or not being true to her people. And she doesn't really realize who he is at first. But just look at this. I'm sorry to jump around like this, but look at this art. Look at Klaus. That is just awesome. He's also the only character in the book that has golden eyes. Everybody else has normal, except for Dagmar and her son. They have red eyes for some reason. But anyway, Klaus is basically seeing if she's as evil as her husband is. And she really thinks, and she doesn't really know if he's a bad guy or a good guy, and she's kind of gauging him, and she's also really offended that this stranger just broke in and is starting to question her like she's the bad guy. We get a bit more conflict, and finally she demands to know who he is. And he tells her he's a friend. She demands he show himself to her. And I'm a Yuletime spirit, a man of mystery. I rely on the shadows for a lot of effect. The gifts I told you about, I made this one for you to replace something you lost. And that's when she finally realizes that this guy who's been here with the gifts, it really is her old childhood friend, Klaus. And look at this reveal. So he tells her he came back because he had to see her. And she's confused. You think she's going to be ecstatic. She starts saying, but, and then she slaps him and accuses him of killing her father. And then we go back to a little bit of narration. That year, the wolves were fierce on the outskirts of the town, which is our cue that we're going back into back in time. But fiercer yet by far was Klaus, young captain of the Grimsvig Guard, handpicked by Baron Ulrich, who was the guy that we saw at the very beginning, who they brought him to when he was a child. You recognize him. So what they're doing is they're hunting the wolves that have been surrounding the town. They've been killing livestock, hurting people. And we jump back to the castle as Klaus is out being Klaus. And we see an older version of the Baron holding a wine. In here, it's basically shown that the Baron kills Lord Ulrich by poisoning his drink. It's very subtle in the dialogue and the art. And then, after we see Lord Ulrich fall, we immediately go back to the forest scene where we last left Klaus. They have a pit with some wolves inside of it. They're preparing to kill the wolves, but you see here, Klaus is actually walking off into the distance because he hears some noise. He pulls apart some brush, and he looks down and sees a little baby wolf. And now they're supposed to be killing these wolves, but look at that. You're not going to kill that, especially when you're Santa. So, of course, he's got some feels. Somebody in the distance calls to him, and he says, no, this is nothing. And before leaving, he gives the little wolf pup a stick of meat. We go back to the castle where, to present time, where we find Klaus and Dagmar still talking. He's basically explaining himself that he didn't kill, he didn't hurt her dad. He never would have hurt her dad. She says that's impossible. The Baron had proof. Then we get a little flashback to the Baron accusing Klaus of basically killing her father. Back to present again as Klaus is explaining that why that couldn't be and why that wouldn't happen. And she says, well, if you didn't do it, Klaus, then why didn't you put up a fight? Another flashback scene to it happening live, where she basically immediately believes that he did it, starts questioning him, attacking him why he's getting hauled off. We can see the future Baron looking pretty proud of himself. And then here's where the feels really hit. Why did I give in? Why did I run and never return? Because you chose him over me. So obviously there was a love interest between Klaus and Dagmar, and he felt betrayed, but because he was a man's man, he didn't come back. He just accepted it and left to go do his own thing because he thought that was what she wanted. Obviously, it was just because there was a liar in the castle. Anyway, we flash back to Klaus after he's been excommunicated from the castle. They've stripped him of his clothes and are walking him out into the woods to kill him when a large wolf appears on the rise. The people now are still just terrified of the wolves because of all the killing that's been happening at this time. So the guards just say, leave him to his fate, and they ditch out. Klaus has this very emotional scene where he basically challenges the wolf, says he has nothing left to live for, and then he basically just collapses. And then that's when we see a familiar face walk up. A slightly younger, slightly thinner Lily gives him a little sniff, licks him in familiarity, and a friendship is forged. And it's also pretty adorable. She just bloop, plops on top of him to keep him warm. We jump back to Klaus talking to Dagmar, and she finally believes that he wasn't responsible for her father's death, and she tells him that he needs to leave immediately because the Baron will have his head if she finds him. We get this nice little scene where Klaus gives her a toy specifically for Jonas. I'm not going to ruin this dialogue because it's really nice, and I've already kind of ruined some things, but this is a very good page. It kind of explains their relationship. And also, look how pretty Dagmar's getting. Just alright. Anyway. So, Dagmar takes the toy that Klaus gave her and rushes back to give it to her son, who is still destroying all the toys that were taken from all the village kids that Klaus had built earlier. He's mad that the magic wasn't working. As she comes in, he's not really interested because he doesn't see how one more toy is going to be any better than all the ones he's already destroyed. Little mallet. But she plops down beside him and tells him that it's something special and shows it to him. At first he's kind of surprised, but he's not overly interested, asks what it is, and she tells him that, or she comes up with a little story idea, and he immediately changes it to something violent and aggressive and is about to destroy it, and she stops him gently and suggests that he does something a little bit different. The kid doesn't really understand. He's never had a friend. He's never been played with. So he immediately turns into a very, very vulnerable child, which is expressed in the art, expressed in the dialogue, and we finally start to see Dagmar and her son really connect. And they start to play with the toys. We even get some of the toys having their magic back. This is the little bird that she got earlier. And they're finally starting to play, and he's finally starting to be a child when the Baron barges in. And of course, he's tired of them having fun and playing while there are literally wolves at the gates of the village. So he tells him that he's got a special plan for Jonas, and it's time for Jonas to become a man, which I thought was really interesting, because the whole story, I mean, the kid has just been abused, not paid attention to, spoiled rotten. It's just not the way you raise a child. And he finally gets attention, which is what he really wants and what he really needs, and he's finally starting to turn into a child, and then boom, immediately the Emperor screws it all up, or Baron, I'm sorry. So we jump back to the mines, suggesting that that's where the Baron is going to be taking him, and the men are tired. They want to go home. They want to spend Christmas or the Yule time with their family, so they're ready to strike. Some of the guards immediately pull weapons to kill them, and we get our old sergeant. And he doesn't order them to do the killing, but this one upstart basically tells him that if he doesn't do it, or if the sergeant doesn't give the order, he will, because it's the Baron's direct instructions that they have to make an example of some of these men. The sergeant remains silent, and the men begin slaughtering the miners. And we get a close-up of the sergeant, and you'll recognize that this is the same guy that was with the redhead, Dagmar's father, when they found Klaus. And he was in most of the flashbacks. He's just older and grayer now. We pan out as to see what the guards did to the miners. And they basically just rubbing it into the surviving miners' face that this is what's going to happen if they don't start paying attention. They put the men back to work, and then that's when we start getting more voices from the rocks. Free me. Free me. Free me. Free me. I'm sorry. And we get a close-up of our sergeant, and he is just freaking out. He's not hip to this voice. He's not hip to what's happening with his life. This is not where he wanted to be right now. We jump back into town. He's left the mine. You can kind of see he's got himself a little bottle. He's walking home, and he's drunk. Enters his house, and there's somebody inside. And he calls him the Ghost Wolf Santa. Klaus basically tells him to put his sword away, that he knows he's not a bad dude. If he was, he would have already attacked him. He calls him by name, which is Carl, and that really off-puts the sergeant. Klaus starts basically running down what the sergeant's done with his years, and he knows that he doesn't want to be doing what he's doing. The sergeant has a heart-to-heart with him, spills his guts, and then demands that he tell him who he is and what he wants. And Santa says the most badass 80s action flick thing yet. I want to give this some context. Okay, so the sergeant says, "You don't think I'm ashamed? The uniform, these colors, the red and white, they used to mean something." And Klaus replies, "They will again, Carl. I'm throwing a Yuletime party, and everyone's invited." The next page we see a nice, gorgeous, panned-out shot of the castle with this wonderful nighttime sky, purples and pinks. And we hear the Baron's voice saying that it has to be written in a child's hand. We go back into the castle and we see Jonas writing a letter, his father standing over his shoulders directing him with what to say. Dagmar enters the room and demands to know what's going on. And we find out that the Emperor is having him write a letter to Santa Claus. And that's the end of chapter 4. This is the cover. I'll be using this as the thumbnail. So you can see there's a lot of foreshadowing. That's one of the nice things about this book. They do plenty of foreshadowing.